Boy, has it been a day already. Relatively soon I need to get ready to hop on a plane and do all that. I'm going to be on a trip. Don't worry, there's some videos scheduled for the time until I get back. But unexpectedly, I'm able to talk about Rescue Rangers, the Chip 'n Dale reboot movie that has, I feel like, had a pretty decent amount of hype, or at least curiosity and interest behind it, especially here on the internet. So just a heads up, I'm not going to be talking about a ton of specifics on the movie itself. I'll touch on a couple of things that stood out to me, but beyond that, I will be getting into one major point that is more of a big picture thing and sort of the current state of reboots from big major Hollywood studios. Okay, to start off, the bare basics, the surface level elements of the movie. For one thing, this is a comedy. We know that both on and off screen, a bunch of ex-SNL people have been involved with this one. For better or worse, it does feel like a movie where a bunch of ex-SNL people were involved. It's a comedy ultimately, and the job of a comedy is to be funny by any means necessary and hopefully not be just like so extremely offensive that it causes some kind of controversy. Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers is pretty funny. Like, I laughed a handful of times. I usually don't find the sense of humor especially funny or entertaining. I laughed a good number of times. I had some fun watching it, especially like the first 20 minutes or so are actually pretty darn solid. Just fun to watch. Now, overall, this sense of humor, it is typified by tons of references and self-referential humor, including like fourth wall breaking kind of stuff very often. I'll talk about how that stuff ties into sort of the bigger point that I'll be getting to later, but just in terms of jokes and humor, I really feel like this is almost exclusively aimed at adult viewers, ideally people who grew up watching the Chip 'n Dale stuff, were already familiar with Rescue Rangers to a certain degree. I don't really know how well this movie is going to work for kids. It can feel very long at times. It can feel pretty slow when it doesn't really need to. There are a lot of adult jokes here, or just like references to adult things that are extremely obvious to an adult viewer. They might go over the head of a younger kid. So if you're a parent wondering whether or not this is family friendly, like, yeah, ultimately it probably is. Whether it would hold their interest or whether you personally feel like you want to expose them to some of these kinds of references to more adult subject matter, totally up to you. Maybe skim through it first to get a read on that. Performances, our leads here are Andy Samberg and John Mulaney. As performers and comedic performers in general, stand-ups, I think they're pretty darn good. I've enjoyed a lot of their work, especially Mulaney's. And here, I'm not a huge fan of either of them as voice actors in general, and in Rescue Rangers, Mulaney in particular feels as flat as can be. Like, he sounds sad. I don't know, like, there's just no energy there, even though the movie overall has a great sense of energy that I really admire. He doesn't feel like he's into it, and it's very noticeable. Like, part of that is the character. Yes, he's supposed to be the one that's more of the straight man. He's more cynical. Even given that, I don't think the performance matches the tone of the rest of the movie. Like, it just doesn't fit. To me, it was noticeably flat. That's that. It's a hybrid animation, live-action movie. In that vein, I think some of the human performances here are extremely weak. They very much remind me of just bad kids' movies that I would see in the theater when I was like 10. Really noticeably bad. Maybe they didn't have like the VA to bounce off of. Maybe it's not their fault. I don't know, but my take, sorry, I really don't enjoy the human characters at all. In terms of just production, attention to detail, yeah, it does seem like they genuinely cared about this movie on a production level. I'm sure plenty of people will make giant videos about like, here's all the Easter eggs you missed, here are all the references to obscure characters that you didn't notice because you were paying attention to all the extremely obvious references to really popular characters in pop culture. And even just some of the animation, we get some claymation stuff here. We get just a bunch of traditional 2D animation on top of like a lot of the more frequent characters who are not outright CG are a combination, like they are 3D models, but the textures are 2D. Sometimes that can look a little bit wonky, and I don't feel like it gives the kind of separation from the 3D models that you feel like you would want here. They ultimately kind of look similar other than just coloring and textures. Those are some surface level things about the movie. They're my thoughts. Overall impressions, yes, it is probably worth checking out, and I have a hunch. I haven't seen a lot of the reaction online so far, but I have a hunch that a lot of people are really going to like this. I think it's going to get a lot of positive press. It's very internet friendly, and as we've seen from plenty of other modern shows and movies, when they're trying to be internet friendly, and there are enough tiny little clips that people can cut up, put on YouTube, spread decent word of mouth virtually, it can be a thing. It can lead to massive success. I mean, that's, in my opinion, that's where a lot of the success of something like Smiling Friends memes comes from. It's extremely internet friendly. It doesn't feel cringy in its attempts to appeal to that crowd. And hey, sometimes just a simple reference to a thing that was funny on the internet can work for a lot of people. At times that even works for me. So I'm not going to fault the movie for doing that at all. I'm not going to fault people for enjoying that kind of humor. Still, they do it so much and so often, and not always in like a creative and fun way. There are a couple sequences that are more creative. They integrate those references more creatively. Not all the time. And it did start to feel old when they just kept piling these on for basically the entire runtime. But the biggest thing I want to talk about here, and this is something that is sort of relevant to larger industry trends, is that this movie wields self-awareness and just self-referential writing like a defense weapon, like a defense mechanism. And this is becoming more common. I think this is something we saw in that Matrix reboot as well, where apparently a bunch of people were satisfied with the movie specifically because they kept addressing like, oh, the fourth wall breaks, and like, oh, the studio wants us to do a reboot. People want to see the old stuff rehashed. And not only that, but we're also seeing this be integrated via the multiverse approach, which has come up it was in Spider-Verse, the Doctor Strange movie that just came out, that Spider-Man movie that apparently made more money than anything ever for some reason. As Jay Bauman of Red Letter Media very correctly pointed out, this multiverse angle, self-awareness is another technique in this area, but the multiverse thing is like just another way for big studios to rehash a bunch of old content and bring in a bunch of member berries without making people like upset, without making it super, I don't know, obvious or annoying. If they can make it kind of funny, if they just make a bunch of references to like how goofy the situation is, and oh look, there are 3 Peter Parkers talking to each other. It works, I guess, for a lot of people. And hey, creatives, industry creatives who have been tasked with doing yet another reboot of a thing, they need techniques. They need new ways, or just creative ways of rebooting old content, rehashing old stuff that somehow feels different, at least on the surface. And in my opinion, both the multiverse approach and this extreme, like hyper self-awareness and self-referential writing, these are both techniques that are currently being used by multiple creative teams working for big giant Hollywood studios. And this is where I start to have some problems. Just watching the movie on its own, surface level, I have a few laughs, it is fine. But as soon as I start to think about it a little bit more, start to analyze it just a tiny little bit, I kind of start to hate it, because it feels like a new coat of paint on some very old stuff and just painted over some very negative things about the contemporary, big studio scene that I really, really don't like, that I think are ultimately pretty harmful to like culture in general. That's a big statement. Okay, so what is this movie ultimately doing that's same old, and maybe negative overall? It is still a reboot. I'm sorry, self-awareness is not an adequate defense against doing something that you know is bad. In fact, it reminds me of this Yahtzee quote from one of his reviews.
Also does the thing where it goes, oh, look, a sewer level, how original, roll eyes, and then proceeds to unironically have a sewer level. If you know it's bad, why are you doing it?
And yeah, I mean, that says it all. Like, just saying, oh boy, we sure don't have any new ideas, and then going on to do the thing they were just saying is bad, that doesn't work. Like, that's not that's not a get out of jail free card. I'm sorry. Like, it works for a quick laugh, but it doesn't hold up over time. No, I do think it's overall a very negative thing for popular culture to just continue to stagnate and rehash old stuff. We're not moving forward. It's clogging up the arteries of popular culture in a way where new stuff has a harder time getting out. That is a problem, I think, overall. If that gets in the way of newness, originality, that might have some serious consequences down the line that we might have to talk about another day. What else? It's covering up for a very bland and typical structure here. The story structure is absolutely nothing new at all. It's just some slightly fresh writing on the top of all of it. I have a whole other video about form and content, about how using the same old structures, even if you change up the content that you put into those structures, can ultimately result in stuff that feels basically exactly the same as things we've seen a million times before. This movie is ultimately weaponizing nostalgia, I think, and more viewers, more and more people in general, I believe, are becoming aware of the fact that, hey, maybe it's pretty uncool to manipulate your audience emotionally, specifically through nostalgia. It's a reflex reaction you have, right? If you're presented with something that you haven't, seen or heard since like a very early age, it's like a biological response it wouldn't be crazy to theorize that sometime in the distant future, it's maybe even made illegal to use nostalgia in that way to benefit financially by manipulating people emotionally. Maybe that sounds crazy at the moment. Maybe it sounds like I'm being overly dramatic. But honestly, Disney is a massive offender in this area. And again, the self-awareness is not an excuse. Like, that doesn't make it okay necessarily. This movie, there's a weird additional sinister element here too. And it's that ultimately it feels like a weird flex on Disney's part. And this probably wasn't the intention, but just the number of properties that they reference or show here in this movie, some of which are licensed from, other rights holders, but many of which are theirs, are solidly Disney at this point, stuff like Muppet, Simpsons, etc., and just tons, huge back catalog of animated characters and such. It feels like them just flexing and saying, like, this is how much of American entertainment history we have just completely consumed, and now we get to trot it out whenever we want. And as long as we have some self-aware jokes about how, like, that's cynical and like it's kind of junky for entertainment companies to do that sort of thing, they are still doing it. They are still doing it. And I think, it's just an unintentional showcase of how much they have just completely swallowed. And that kind of made me feel uncomfortable. So again, this is not surface level stuff. This is stuff that just kind of came to mind in the more boring parts of the movie where the gears started turning in my head, or where I tried to be a little bit more analytical about it. Again, I just finished watching the movie. I would maybe like to do a deeper dive and have a larger discussion about all of these topics and the nostalgia baiting and the self-reference defenses and all that stuff. But for the moment, I really do have to get going. I have to edit this and literally get out the door. So I apologize for the lack of fancy editing and all that kind of stuff. This is just, I needed to get some of the stuff off my chest before I'm away from the mic for a good stretch of time. But yeah, please share your thoughts. I would be very interested to hear what other people think about this. But that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.